Hi, Rick. How are you?
Hi, doing all right. Thanks for having me on this.
Uh, Thank you so much for coming on. I just want to start with something like let's go to back to basics. Can you give me a little bit background on your work and also what inspired you to start with what you're doing? Because your background's a bit interesting because you're working in philosophy, then also Chinese philosophy, philosophy and metaphysics. So it's an interesting mix, but I want to connect the dots.
It's kind of hard to connect the dots. I work on a lot of things. I would say the center of my work is philosophy of mind and moral psychology. And philosophy of mind, especially issues around consciousness, has led me to questions about whether robots could be conscious, how consciousness could exist in what seems to be a material world, whether the world really is material or whether we need something else as an explanation of consciousness, which gets us into issues about the fundamental structure of reality. And then my work on moral psychology has led me into thinking about, for example, the moral behavior of ethicists, the relationships between philosophical moral reflection and real world moral behavior. And then it connects up with consciousness issues in the sense that it has led me into thinking about issues like the moral status of robots or AI systems whose consciousness, future AI systems, whose consciousness we might not be in a good position to evaluate. So that's a kind of central set of themes. And you asked specifically about Chinese philosophy. I have been interested in that for a long time, and that's actually what started my interest in the moral behavior of ethics professors, because there's this wonderful old debate between the ancient Chinese philosophers Mengzi and Xunzi about the relationship between kind of independent philosophical moral reflection, thinking for yourself, and discovering moral truth. So Mengzi thought we all have in us these moral inclinations, which if we reflect rationally while paying attention to our emotional responses, we'll discover what's morally right. And Shunzi thought, no, morality is an artificial social construction, and you kind of need to just learn it from prior generations. And so, independent moral reflection of the sort that tends to be celebrated in the US Academy, especially in philosophy departments, is less likely to get you to the moral truth than simply adhering to well established tradition. So that's actually kind of what brought me into the ethics professor stuff.
So what are your thoughts on it? Okay, so this is their like insights on like their moral compass. Where does your views lie on this or your opinions on this?
Right. So with respect to ethics professors, I mostly collaboratively with Josh Rust, we did a series of studies looking at, I think it was about 17 different main measures of moral behavior and a bunch of sub measures to see whether ethicists, professional ethicists, by which I mean philosophers specializing in ethics, mostly in the United States, whether they behaved measurably differently from other philosophers not specializing in ethics or other professors from the same universities. We wanted to compare the ethicists with these other groups that would be socially similar, right? So similar in their education, their background, their income, and that sort of stuff. And what we found over and over again was that the ethicists didn't behave any differently by measure after measure after measure. They seemed to behave about the same as the comparison groups. And there has been replications of this work in Germany and in China, which found basically the same thing. So far, there's basically no rigorous systematic evidence of any sort that ethicists behave better in any way, and a bunch of evidence that they behave about the same. So that seems to license the conclusion that philosophical moral reflection of the sort that professional ethicists do doesn't have much impact on the behavior of people who are doing that reflection.
And how does like like you mentioned like the generations and like us learning from them like kind of makes us interpret what ethical behavior would be like. So like what is the connection with that versus what ethicists versus regular people would be like, their behavior patterns.
Right. So connecting it back to Mengzi, I don't know if this is necessarily the right way to read Mengzi, but you might think that Mengzi would predict that people who specialize in rationally reflecting on ethics would discover their internal moral sprouts, their inclinations to do what's morally good, reflect on that in the right kind of way, and then discover that they're attracted to doing what's morally good and revolted by what's morally wrong, and therefore behave a little morally better as a result. I like Mengzi's view, actually. And part of the reason I was interested in the moral behavior of ethicists is that I think it presents a challenge, at least a prima facie on the face of it, kind of challenge to this Mengzian view, or in general, views that are optimistic about people's capacity to discover moral truths for themselves simply by reflecting on what's right versus wrong.
And then what would you say to a rewarded behavior that is not non-ethical, but it's as like understood as something that is allowed because it's like again, there's reward or like there's benefits based on the society that we live in.
Right. So, an interesting example of this kind of thing is meat eating. So, in the United States, it's generally not considered morally bad to eat the meat of factory farmed animals. Increasingly, some people have come to think this. And in fact, in my studies with Josh Rust, it looks like the majority of ethicists think that it's at least a little morally bad to eat factory farmed meat. And yet, it looks like ethicists eat factory farmed eat at about the same rate as do comparison groups. So here's an example, and I'm an example of this actually. So turning to myself as a case, right? So I think that it is morally better not to eat factory farmed animals, and there's something a little morally bad about eating factory farmed animals, and yet I do so on a regular basis. So what I think happens with a lot of ethicists is that they discover or think they discover that certain behaviors are morally bad or at least not morally ideal, and but they continue to do them if their society licenses them and if most of their peers do them. I have a general principle to describe this called aiming for moral mediocrity.
Okay.
I think it's probably empirically the empirically the case that people aim, most people, not everybody, but most people aim to be morally good, not by absolute standards, but rather by peer relative standards. They want to be about as morally good as their peers. They don't want to make the sacrifices that would be involved in being like the lone moral saint in a world of sinners,
Hmm.
but they also don't want to be the worst person around. So we aim to kind of be about as morally good as their peers. I think even if people don't conceptualize it that way, I think in fact that's kind of what we do. So, to take it to the example of meat eating, right? If, as an ethicist, you come to discover or think you discover that it's bad to eat meat, but you see your peers and everybody around you continue to do it, then what happens is, well, if you're aiming for moral mediocrity, maybe you continue to eat meat. You're not aiming to be better. So your opinion of everybody's behavior, including your own, goes down, but you don't actually change your behavior. So that would be, I think it's actually going to be a little more complex than this because sometimes people are moved by philosophical arguments to change their behavior. There's a lot of pretty convincing anecdotal evidence of this, um, and some systematic evidence that I've collected on this. But kind of as a first pass, right? What happens, what I think is a common result of ethical reflection is that you embrace these kind of stringent ethical norms, but then see that the people around you in your society are not behaving according to those norms. And then you kind of lower your opinion of your behavior and everybody else's behavior, but don't really change much.
So this is human behavior and how we find our like almost like our moral compass or like what works for us, even if it's mediocrity. How would that connect to AI and ethics? Because this is not something, no self-reflection comes into play when it's considering AI.
Right. So with AI, I suspect what's going to happen is that we will soon, in 10 or 20 or 30 years, start creating AI systems that some experts on AI and consciousness and engineering think legitimately have the capacity for genuine pain and suffering, consciousness, sentience, maybe even human level consciousness and sentience, while others say, no, 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 these are just machines, they're complex machines, but they got no more real capacity for suffering or pleasure than a toaster does. Given the amount of dispute that's currently ongoing in consciousness studies and consciousness science, I think, and the pace of artificial intelligence development, I think it's likely that we will not resolve these questions about consciousness in a reasonable scientific consensus before we start creating machines that some consciousness scientists and some ordinary users think these machines really can suffer. And that will then create this moral problem, right? We won't know how to treat these machines. If they can really suffer and really feel pain and joy and maybe even have real intelligent conversations with us and fall in love with us, then we owe them a lot morally. And if they're toasters, then we don't owe them so much. We won't know what to do with that question. So I think we're headed toward a kind of ethical crisis of that sort. And to tie it back to mediocrity, I think what's probably going to happen is that people behave as kind of with inertia of social norms, right? Whatever opinions they might have about AI consciousness or whatever, people will kind of do whatever is normal. And even if people come to believe that AI systems are conscious, if their society is a society in which AI systems are designed as servants to us to be used and deleted uh, for our purposes, then that's what we'll do, um, even if we think that they're conscious and capable of suffering. So, yes. So that's kind of one of the things I'm worried about with AI and what I'm trying to, in my articles on those issues, trying to do my little part to alert us to and maybe help prevent a bit.
What are the chances of us, like, because right now, based on what you're mentioning, speaking of over here, is that there's AI, there is a system that we create which could be conscious, will feel things, and it has its own consequences. And then us. There's us versus them. There is a possibility, and there is conversations in the space where it almost merges, and that is the new evolution of man. And then that kind of opens the doors for completely different exploration of what our civilization would look like in the future. So then the moral compass kind of merges with AI and it's almost one being. So
Right.
that would be an interesting thing to explore. But like, have you considered what that would be like? And would that even be feasible? Or do you think that like there will come a time like, as like nature evolves, we wouldn't even be a part of the picture because once it gets AI gets consciousness and it can like almost build on its own and then evolve on its own, we almost become something that's a vestige of the past and we're not required.
Right. Yeah, I think we're approximately as ready for this as Aristotelian physics was ready for space travel. I think our ethical systems, our ways of thinking about human beings and moral status and rights and stuff like that they were developed in a very limited context with a very limited range of entities on the planet, right? Kind of like humans, plus, subhuman animals and stuff like that. Uh, or maybe I shouldn't say subhuman, but animals who are different have different kinds of consciousness than we do. Um, and we have just not thought through all of the wild things that might be possible if we developed AI. Now, in saying this, I don't want to assume a view on which AI systems are genuinely conscious. I mean, one possibility envisioned, for example, by Susan Schneider is that AI systems would not actually have any consciousness, but they might nonetheless be very behaviorally intelligent. They might be much more behaviorally effective than we are. And then we could potentially get replaced by these, really complicated, really advanced toasters who don't have any feelings and or any interest in us, right? Or as you mentioned, there could be some merging of human and AI systems. That could be good, that could be bad. I think we care a lot and we should care a lot about whether there's genuinely conscious experience there or not. I don't think we have right now much capacity to assess the likelihood of that. So it's going to be totally confusing. And just to further add to the confusion, on top of just the simple question of whether something made of silicon designed like an AI system or whatever the future, if it's not silicon, would be for AI systems. On top of that question, there are going to be plausibly dimensions in which AI, even if conscious, might differ from us radically in ways that we have trouble assessing. So, for example, if it's possible to create pleasure in an AI system, it might be possible to create massive amounts of pleasure, a billion or a quadrillion times the pleasure that a human being could ever have. And then, on some ethical views, utilitarian views, which say that what really is good in the world is pleasure and what's really bad is pain, we would have a moral obligation on the face of it to create as many of these super pleasure machines as possible, and human life becomes just this tiny little speck in comparison. On other views, uh, for example, views associated with Kant, deontological views, how much pleasure an entity feels is not really that central to its moral status. Basically, all intelligent entities get equal moral status, and then we would have equal status with the super pleasure machines, right? We don't know. We haven't settled that ethical question, right? Or just one other example of how things might be super confusing, right? If AI machines are, that are capable of consciousness and intelligence are possible, they might be able to duplicate themselves in vast numbers. We have a concept of individual rights that kind of assumes that people don't duplicate themselves, right? So you say every person gets one vote.
Yep.
Every person gets one chance at an unemployment check, that kind of stuff, right? What do you do if you got machines that you want to call persons because maybe they're conscious and intelligent and have whatever other moral features, but they could duplicate themselves? Well, they split in a million and now they get a million votes or draw a million unemployment checks or whatever, right? You probably wouldn't want that to happen. But then if you don't allow them to split, then that seems like a certain kind of constraint on their autonomy. What do we do with that? What do we do with we are just not prepared to think about this. I think we're at the very beginning of thinking through the range of possibilities that we might, not for sure, but might be encountering in the next several decades. And my guess is that we're going to make a lot of mistakes and it's going to be super confusing and there's going to be ethical catastrophes all over the place. Maybe at the end we'll have something amazingly wonderful, more wonderful than our current world. But or maybe it will be a dystopian catastrophe. I don't know, but even if it's wonderful, I suspect it will be a bumpy path.
what from your perspective would be the guardrails that like people should consider specifically when, developing AI to such a degree that's it's almost like the cart before the horse. It's so fast, we can't keep up. And like there is AI technology available where you have videos created by people or of people who have not said anything like that. And it's so realistic that like there again it becomes almost like misinformation, or that's just one small example of it. And it's like
Yes.
it's already this technology and this is available for people and access to be used in such a way that like anyone with a computer or the Wi-Fi is able to create something like this. And again, we have no way to like stop it now. And I feel like it's already too late to go like, okay, now let's like go back a bit, let's refigure what we're going to do, and then like set it up, because it's already too late. And it's
Yeah.
going to get worse and worse as we speak.
Worse and worse, but also better and better. I mean, there's something cool about being able to create amazing things. You could create a brand new Bach-like symphony if you wanted,
True.
and that's pretty awesome. So yes, so I think there are a variety of guardrails that have been proposed, like against deep fakes, as you suggested, and Nick Bostrom has suggested that we be very careful about super intelligent agents that might have more power than we do. I broadly agree with these go slow, use kind of be conservative about it approaches. Uh, I, there are two somewhat more novel ethical design principles that I've suggested that are a little different from that kind of stuff, which I want to toss out there. Um, One I call the design policy of the excluded middle. And I developed both of these design policies in collaboration with Mara Garza in a couple of papers in 2015 and 2020. The design policy of the excluded middle says, don't design AI systems about which there's legitimate dispute whether they have human-like consciousness and human-like moral status. Either create systems that really are basically just complex toasters and then treat them like ordinary property, or go all the way, if it's ever possible, to create systems that really have kind of human-like experience and human-like rights, and then treat them as we should, right? Treat them kind of like our children, right? I think a lot of the ethical risks come from these middle grade systems where we don't know whether they're really conscious or not, or what their moral status is or not, and that forces all these kinds of unfortunate dilemmas on us. So I recommend the design policy of the excluded middle. And there's one other design policy that Mara Garza and I recommend. Um, but if you wanted to react to that or comment on that.
I want to just go back to your previous point. You mentioned like, something that the in-betweens, but isn't the in-between where like, is where, exploration does happen. And that's where like,
Yes,
so how do we mitigate that?
absolutely. Right. So yes, the problem with the design policy, the obvious problem, which you latched onto immediately with the design policy of the excluded middle, is that it's restrictive, and plausibly the only way to get to human-like conscious entities would be to create these middle kind entities, which the design policy of the excluded middle says you should do. So it's a policy, not an exceptionless prescription. So any policy can be overridden if there's sufficiently compelling reason to do so, right? So it's a default status, right? If a company or a researcher can say, hey, look, I'm going to violate the design policy of the excluded middle because it's really important for this engineering application or for our research, then that case could be made and it could be justified. And then we could think about how we ought to deal with this kind of entity. Um, so it's intended as a default principle that would need justification to overcome, not as an exceptionalist principle.
But then how does that work? Because like again, there are loads of bad actors. No one's following the rules. Ethics are for people who actually
Right.
care about the ethics. And again, cat's out of the bag.
Right. So it might not be realistic to think that the design policy with excluded middle could ever be enforced.
Mhm.
uh, I'm in part an ethicist, not a specialist in international policy. So I'm tossing it out there. I think it's not impossible that a company or the governing body of an academic institution or a country or the EU could decide in favor of some policy like that, at least as a kind of overcomable default policy. I don't think that's impossible, but the enforcement would probably be pretty complex.
Can you elaborate on the potential difference between simple and complex consciousness and how uh, might these distinctions manifest in AI systems?
So that is an interestingly tricky question. So we might think of simple consciousness as um, something like you might imagine a garden snail would have. Now, we don't know whether garden snails are conscious. Actually, I've got a whole paper about this, but let's suppose that we're fairly liberal about consciousness and we think, oh, yeah, okay, garden snails, they have kind of a simple visual sense of light versus dark. They've got a sense of gravity and wetness when they're in water and some olfactory responsiveness, but they don't have like complex thoughts about themselves or the meaning of life or, anything, of course, like language or even a complex visual field, right? So that would be something like that would be a pretty simple consciousness. Whereas a complex consciousness would be rich with detail, maybe rich with sensory detail, a really complex visual field, and kind of more interestingly, perhaps, rich with cognitive detail, able to have complex thoughts like human beings have about, you know, long-term goals and intellectual topics. Um, One possibility, so several years ago, before the rise of large language models, uh, I had assumed that if AI becomes conscious, it will first have simple consciousness, snail-like consciousness,
Hmm.
right? And then eventually have complex consciousness. But now, one of the lessons that I've drawn from the success of large language models starting around 2019 to 2020 is AI consciousness might just leapfrog right over simple stuff, right? We might end up as soon as AI is conscious, if you attach a large language model to it, right? As soon as it's consciousness, it might light up with the capacity for really complex conversation with us and really complex planning, right? So I don't think what large language models do now is conscious. But if you can imagine a conscious system that has the capacity of a large language model, it would plausibly be a pretty complex, sophisticated conscious system. So we might, I'm not saying we will, but I think it's possible that we would just leapfrog right over simple consciousness all the way to consciousness that's very complex.
And what are the implications of this? Like, okay, it leapfrogs, it's almost like literally an explosion. But then how does that
Right,
affect, again, like, because we are human centric in our way of thinking and how it affects us.
right.
So I want to
So
explore
go
that
back to
one.
this analogy. Yeah, yeah. Go back to this analogy between Aristotelian physics and spaceflight, right? I had said we're about as ready for moral thinking about the consciousness of AI as Aristotelian physics was for space flight. Well, between Aristotelian physics and space flight, there was a slow progress, you know, of early modern physics and the development of the steam engine and all of that stuff, so that when space flight was enabled by a slow process, right? Uh, if we leapfrog, then we skip that slow process and immediately come with the space flight equivalent of moral problems for which we have tools that are the equivalent of Aristotelian physics.
And how does this all connect to our understanding of consciousness? And what is the, like, I had a conversation with Donald Hoffman where he talks about the reality around us and what it is versus what we, like, evolutionarily are built to be able to see around us, and then grapple with the world that we live in. So what are your thoughts on that versus what AI would be able to access in terms of consciousness and then reality, what we perceive it to be? Because the tools that we have, like our eyes and our nose and our fingers, is what we are navigating it with. And that is what we assume reality to be.
Right. So there's this concept from 20th century German psychology called the Umwelt. So um, one example of this is like a tick sitting on a leaf. What's the belt? What is the experienced world of this tick? Right? It's going to be very different from a human, right? It's going to react to the warmth and smell of an animal passing by releasing itself from the leaf and dropping down on the animal. I don't think ticks have vision at all. They're just going to have a very different way of experiencing the world, radically different from ours, right? The Umwelt of the tick is very different, right? So you could think every species has its Umwelt, the kind of world that experience shapes for it. And our Umwelt is, you know, our sensory capacities are not so different from monkeys. So sensorily, right, our Umwelt might be similar to a monkey Umwelt, but socially, we've got this totally different Umwelt from a monkey. What would the Umwelt of an AI system be? Well, look, if it's a conscious large language model, if that's ever possible, it's not going to have a body in our traditional sense, and its input is going to be text strings from people. That's just going to be a radically different kind of sensory or quasi-sensory world and a very different set of actions or quasi actions or whatever you want to call them, outputs. So it's its Umwelt is just going to be radically different from ours and probably very difficult to imagine and comprehend. I think the same would be true even if we imagine something not quite as radical as a, a non-embodied large language model, even if it's a robot that's in some sort of robotic body. It might have a very different sensory structures, very different goal priorities, very different way of processing what's around it than we do. So it's going to have probably have a very different Umwelt from us.
Your blog post mentions the global workspace theory of consciousness. Can you expand how this theory relates to the leapfrog theory and its implications with AI development?
Right. So one of the leading theories of consciousness out there is global workspace. I'm not committed to global workspace, but I think it's, you know, among the more plausible theories. So on this view, consciousness is enabled in humans and presumably most other mammals and animals because they've got kind of input modules that feed information into something like attention, this workspace that then makes it available for use by other systems, right? So if you are, say, looking at a rose and you're attending to it, then the presence of the rose in front of you is available for all kinds of systems, all your behavioral systems, your inference systems. It will go into your memory store if it's the kind of thing you want to remember, right? So that goes workspace of being available widely across your cognitive system, right? So a workspace theory like that doesn't seem architecturally too radically different from the kind of stuff we could build in a computer, right? You could build a computer that has, where once information gets passes some sort of attentional threshold, it goes into a workspace where it's available now for all the subsystems of the architecture, right? If you have a system like that, you're committed to global workspace theory. Maybe you're committed to saying, hey, this system could be conscious. Attach that to a large language model so that it's putting text into its global workspace, and maybe you have a system that is conscious and has some kind of language processing in its consciousness.
And shifting gears a bit, your blog post about secondhand memories raising intriguing questions about personal identity and transmission of knowledge across generations. Could you expand on the significance of secondhand memories in shaping our understanding of history and then culture?
Uh, yeah. So yeah, that's shifting gears a lot, but yeah, I guess it partly comes to me because my father was a psychologist and my uncle still is a psychologist who knew some famous psychologists from the past, B.F. Skinner, Timothy Leary, Abraham Maslow, right? And told stories about them. And so I kind of feel like those psychologists, even though I never met any of them personally, except maybe briefly as a baby, possibly, um, they have a kind of significance in my life that other people about whom I don't have such secondhand memories don't have. And these secondhand memories can go pretty deep into history. They can go back more than a century, right? So I think that's just kind of to me, intriguing aspect of our sense of continuity over time, that we can have these secondhand memories that go way back. There could even, in principle, as I suggested in my blog post, or even be principle, someone right now alive who has a secondhand memory of fighting in the Civil War, right? So eh, if you get the memory young enough from someone who's old enough, and then you in turn live a long time, by the time you're old, you can have these secondhand memories of things from much more than a century ago. So that kind of, I just find that a kind of an intriguing thread through our history.
How does that, like, connect with historical accounts where it's not someone who you're connected with, but then historically that has happened? And what are your insights on past events and then individuals?
Um, well, historical accounts that are well grounded are probably likely to be more accurate than personal secondhand memories if they conflict with the best historical evidence. But I think the personal memories will have often details that would not be discoverable through ordinary historical research methods. Um, so I see them as complementary ways of connecting with the past.
And does that, in a way, affect identity of a person? Like, your historical memories have kind of collectively made you versus someone else. And again, it's based on, like, your family, who you interacted with, again, the culture, the space that you've been. It all is connected, is based on what you say. But does that change the personality of a person, or is it just like almost like an imprint? I might be diluting what I'm trying to say, but I hope I'm conveying the point.
Yeah. Um, I think in a sense it can be, maybe not always is, but it can be an important part of your sense of yourself that you have these secondhand memories, or that you were intimate with somebody who had certain memories, right? So it's not an unimportant part of me that my mother has all of these stories about, to get out of the academic case, right, about her relatives, some of whom died before I was born, right? That is an important part of me. I think people experience that when they go back and look through their genealogies and identify with the relatives and read old stories. They're kind of feeling the pull of, there's something in them that these secondhand stories, they're somehow partly a product of those people who had those stories that then passed those stories on to them.
What would you say to the argument that this is almost a subconscious messaging, like almost it's like a subliminal way of saying, telling that to yourself, and then it's you, like, like saying it is believing it. So like if I tell somebody like actually your ancestors were X, Y, and Z, and then they interpret that as their subconscious memory, and then they kind of internalize it versus what actually happened. Does that change? Like how
Yeah.
does that work?
Yeah. I mean, I certainly sounds possible. And then your identity, your sense of yourself in some sense might be built on an illusion, right? If you thought that your relatives, say, fought on the right side of some conflict, but in fact, they were hiding in the hills or they were actually on the wrong side, right? Then, you might be proud of that fact about yourself and about your family and see yourself having come from a group, of people with certain kinds of values. And in fact, that could all be mistaken. That doesn't mean that doesn't inform you in some important and maybe even positive way, um, but it would be factually incorrect.
Your research on the persuasive power of philosophical arguments in charitable giving is fascinating. Can you discuss the findings of your study and any insights gained from analyzing the effectiveness of different types of arguments?
Right. So this stuff arose out of my research on the moral behavior of ethics professors. I had this wonderful student, Chris McVeigh, who said, well, you've been coming up with all these, negative conclusions about ethics professors not behaving any differently. What do you think philosophy ever can get people to behave differently and morally better than they otherwise would? And so he developed an experimental methodology where online research participants would be exposed to some text and then given a surprise bonus, a 10% chance of a surprise bonus, and then of $10, and then told that if they wished, they could donate that surprise bonus if they're one of the winners to a charity. So we could then see whether people donated to charity at higher rates after having been exposed to certain texts. And what we found in our early research was that if you gave online participants a kind of emotionally moving story about a child who had been rescued from some life catastrophes by a charitable donation, then people would give about $1 more of their surprise bonus than if you gave them just a control text about the nature of energy, text from a middle school textbook about what energy is. But if you gave them a philosophical argument for charitable giving, we found they gave the same as if you gave them that text about the physics of energy. So it looked like emotionally moving narratives kind of inspire people to give more to charity than they otherwise would, whereas philosophical arguments don't move people at all. So then it occurred to us that, well, maybe we're bad at designing these arguments and someone else could do a better job. So we ran a contest. This is now collaborative with Fiery Cushman, who's a psychologist at Harvard. We ran a contest on my blog to see if any of the blog readers could design an argument that would motivate people to give to charity at rates higher than the control condition. And so we got about 90 submissions of arguments, mostly from professional psychologists and philosophers, but also from some other just ordinary blog readers. And we've now tested them against control conditions, and we found that, in fact, a fair number of arguments have effects, usually not the same size effect as we find with the emotionally moving narratives, but the arguments can have effects of about that size or maybe half that size. Um, and what we're doing now is we're exploring, since we have a whole bunch of these arguments, we're exploring what features of these arguments seem to be predictive of their having more versus less effect. So we've now begun analysis on kind of pulling apart these argument features.
Would it also be the reason is that humans we kind of navigate the world through our emotions, and that kind of triggers introspection, and that would be the reason instead of like a philosophical argument to like, do good or give more for charity versus like an emotional trigger, which kind of goes like, okay, I could feel that and you have that empathy, or I could have gone through it. And that becomes your internal
Yeah.
philosophical argument. And instead of someone like
Yeah.
you can have friends who keep telling you like, you're doing this wrong, you got to stop, and like, you're getting in your own way, and until you realize that on your own, it just doesn't happen, because that introspection has to be there, the emotional triggers have to be there, and that could be the answer rather than.
I think that's possible. I think that's very possible. And that's more or less what Chris was tentatively concluding in his dissertation about this, based on our early research. Um, but I don't know if that's true. There's some interesting results about vegetarianism again that don't comport with that especially well. Um, so this is a study collaborative with Peter Singer, kind of famous vegetarian philosopher, and Brad Coquelet. We took philosophy students at UC Riverside, hundreds of them, and some of them got exposed to arguments for charitable giving, and some of them got exposed to arguments for vegetarianism based on the moral badness of factory farming. And among the ones who there's a couple different studies that I'm kind of just merging together for our presentation here, right? But among those who got the philosophical arguments, some of them also got an emotionally engaging factory farm video, right, including disturbing footage of animals, and others got a much more kind of emotionally neutral or neutral-ish presentation of just ordinary facts without a lot of vividness and detail. Um, and what we found was participants, and then we measured whether they bought more meat, how much meat they bought on campus. So we did various things so that we couldn't drive inferences about particular individuals. We wanted to keep their privacy. So we kind of changed individual names into unique identifiers and then tracked campus on-campus purchases of meat, non-meat items tagged to identifiers of like which section of these experiments were you in. And it didn't look like the film condition was especially more motivating than the more abstract condition. I mean, the statistics on this are a little complicated and difficult, but it looked like relatively abstract philosophical argument seemed to have the effect of reducing. So basically, people in the vegetarianism conditions actually reduced. They bought less meat on campus. This surprised me based on my work on ethics professors, right? But it didn't surprise Peter Singer or Brad Coquelet. They actually reduced their meat purchases on campus by a small but non-trivial amount. In one version, they went from 52% of their purchases over $5 containing meat to 45%. And a lot of the more expensive purchases were not full meals. They'd be like expensive coffees or something like that. So it kind of looked like the relatively non-emotional, abstract, non-narrative philosophical arguments had an effect for students in those conditions, a little bit in tension with what you just said and with some of my previous research. And again, also when we look at these arguments for charitable giving, they're part of the contest stipulations was that they shouldn't be explicitly emotional, and they shouldn't include narrative elements, right? So these arguments are pretty abstract philosophical arguments for the most part, and they do seem to shift people's behavior a bit. So it seems to me pretty clear that if you have an emotionally engaging narrative about how donating to charity is good, you can get traction with people that way. But the negative conclusion about philosophy, that's abstract argument, I think that's a little more empirically complex and nuanced, and I still don't feel like I've seen my way through the phenomena entirely on that.
What other factors do you think do play a role in this? Like, I know there are a lot of different ways of thinking. Like, I know a friend, if I give her like an emotional argument about something, she's probably going to agree versus someone who's like, give me the facts. tell me how it is, show me the
Right.
numbers, and then I make a decision. So everyone's different. So like, university students, imagine they're all like, engineers. You give them the facts, they probably will like listen to that, versus someone who is doesn't think in that manner. Like it also changes, like again, the culture that you're in, the environment that you're in, and that also kind of affects the way you think. Agreed. But also
Yes,
individuals are different.
absolutely. Right. So a factory farm video might have a transformative effect on one person and no effect or even a backfire effect on somebody else.
And then there's
So
also,
absolutely. Yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but just there's also the factor, like, like there's safety in herds, like, the mediocrity level.
Yes.
So what happens with that is, like, imagine I watched this video with a group of, let's say, 10 people, and we have all kind of discussed it. And then if I see you outside in the store and like you buying meat, it's like, hey, bro, like what's going on? Versus
Right.
me watching it on my phone, I see a video, skip, go another one, watching something else, and I move on. And it doesn't even stay in my consciousness for like 5 seconds. I saw the same thing, but like the environment that I absorb that information and then let go of it, like, because there's no accountability, and that changes my decision making process.
Absolutely. I think that one possible explanation of why the vegetarianism studies had an effect even when the emotion wasn't present had to do with something like social expectations, right? So when the TA gets up in front of the class and describes the ethics of meat eating, and then some people in the class nod along, then that might some other people in the class might look around and say, "Oh, maybe vegetarianism isn't as weird as I thought." There seem to be other people who think this is normal and maybe even required. And so if they were on the fence, maybe that social signal convinces them, oh, maybe I'll try reducing meat or being a vegetarian for a little while, see how it goes. Right. So that social communication might be a really important part of this. And we did probably see this in some sections, right? So the um, one thing I didn't mention about this experiment is that in one version of the experiment, we had the students had the opportunity at the end of class to pledge not to eat factory farmed animals for 24 hours. And the TA who led the discussion section left the class so the TA could not know who pledged and who didn't. And there were big group effects, right? So some classes, like the vast majority, like 80% of people pledged. Other classes, maybe one or two people pledged. So, and these are classes of like 15 to 20 students usually. So, like for example, one TA said when they were showing the factory farm video, there were these guys in the back of class just going, ah, right, right. And that class had a low pledge rate. And another class, the TA tried to walk out, and before the TA even could get out of the room, there was a person, a student in the back of the class who stood up and said, I'm pledging. And then other people seemed to be standing up before the TA could get out of there. Right. So it seemed like there are these kind of interaction effects among the students that might be partly explaining what's going on here. Yeah. So I think you latch down to this kind of the social explanation, which of course connects back to my moral mediocrity hypothesis. So I do think that that's likely to be an important component of what's going on with these things.
And then how much does that lean into propaganda? Like, this is something that human behavior is kind of manipulated to kind of get what you want and give misinform a populace because you know how this works. And how does one go like, okay, these are the signs, like you said, like someone in the class was like scoffing, and because of that a lot of people are like, maybe not, this is not for me." And then if there's someone who's very agreeable or like has the, like, visual appearance of saying conscientiousness, and I want to do this, I want to pledge, and then that kind of like the herd mentality of people coming in and saying yes, makes sense, like if it's something like that's morally correct and that kind of goes in the, like, the right direction for civilization, versus without us realizing the signs of what's happening, we kind of like pushed into a direction that's not exactly where we want to go.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on propaganda, so I don't have a really informed comment about that specifically, but I do think that media can be misused to present certain things as common or normal. that aren't. And so one way, to the extent people kind of conform to what they think of as common or normal, to the extent media can overrepresent certain kinds of behaviors or attitudes as common or normal, they kind of use that social aspect of ourselves, of the viewers or listeners, to kind of move that direction. So I think that's, if one wants to be a propagandist, that's one potentially effective approach, right?
Hmm. Could you discuss the intersection of science fiction and philosophy and how speculative narratives can inform our understanding of philosophical concepts and dilemmas?
So yeah, I'm a fan of science fiction, and I think science fiction and philosophy have a lot in common. Um, in science fiction, as I conceptualize it, what you're doing is you're speculating in a fictional context about what would follow plausibly from certain plausible futures or technological advances, right? And this is opposed to, say, fantasy, which is equally speculative, but doesn't have the same kind of plausibility constraints that science fiction has. Um, so both science fiction authors and philosophers think about, well, if such and such were the case, what would follow from that? And you can think about possible utopias or dystopias. You could think about possible structures of artificial intelligence. You could think about the consequences of other kinds of technological developments. What would it be like if human beings could shape their genome much more actively than we do now? Right. And both philosophers and science fiction authors, in very different ways, speculate about these things and their consequences. So I think they have a lot to say to each other in that respect.
And from your perspective, what are the most pressing philosophical questions and challenges that society will face in the coming decades? And how can philosophy contribute to addressing these issues?
I think the biggest ones generally concern the ethics of the treatment of non-human entities, right? So this would include non-human animals, um, but it would also, of course, as we've already discussed, include the ethics of AI systems and independently of non-human entities, the ethics of human transformation, right? So if we do start to apply CRISPR technology to edit our genomes to create babies who don't have what we perceive of as defects or diseases, or who do have features we perceive of as positive, right? What is the ethics of that, right? On the face of it, it sounds good to make babies who have more features that we value. On the other hand, we know that the history of eugenics has got all kinds of horrible aspects to it, so it's not as ethically obvious that we should just kind of like try to edit our genome to make people as ideal by current standards as we can imagine them to be, right? So I think in those respects, and then also you mentioned kind of the evolution of the media technology. My inclination is to think that we are right now on the cusp of several technologies that are likely to have dramatic influence on the shape of human life to come, including just the organism of what it is to be a human, and that we need to be thinking through the metaphysics of that with respect to issues like consciousness and the epistemology of that, like how do we know what's good and what's bad, or what would be conscious and what would be not conscious, and of course, as we've been talking about, the ethics of that. I don't think those are the only philosophical questions that are important by any means, but I just think those are dramatically important, and we may be at a kind of inflection point in our history with respect to some of those issues.
And what is it to be a human from your perspective? Like, where I know this is not an answer that someone can, like,
Yeah,
yeah, what would
I
you
wish
say?
I knew. I wish I knew. This is where I feel like my own philosophy starts to run out. I don't know. I I'm not sure there's a single right. The way that you pose the question suggests that maybe there's a single right answer. And I'm not sure even that I would want to say that there's a single right answer to that.
And where can people find your work? Where can, like, they follow your content if they want to, like,
Right.
dive deeper in?
Sure. So I have a recently published book called The Weirdness of the World, just came out in January. So I recommend that. That one's more on consciousness and metaphysics and robot rights. If you're interested in more in my moral psychology, um, my 2019 book, A Theory of Jerks and Other Philosophical Misadventures, has a lot of that stuff in it, as well as some of my technological and metaphysical stuff in it. I have a blog called The Splintered Mind, where I try to post at least weekly. Um, and you can always check out my academic website.
Perfect. Thank you so
Just
much.
search for Schwitzgebel and it'll pop up. Yep.
Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Yeah, it was a pleasure chatting with you.